Good afternoon. I'm Dave Beck from Classical King. Welcome to our celebration today of a fine fellow who has been your warm and witty radio companion for 33 years now. Brad Eaton has been dispensing morning jolts of musical espresso, rays of Mozartian sunshine, and puns, eliciting a mixture of praise and groans since November of 1989. And in this next hour, we'll do our very best to drag some stories out of him because heaven knows Brad does not like to talk. It's hard to get him to talk. We'll get to questions that many of you have submitted in advance. We'll share some of the many stories and outpourings of affection that have come Brad's way since his retirement was announced a few weeks back. And we'll leave room today for you to share good words and ask questions of this gentleman who has so entertained, informed, amused us, and supplied us with beautiful sounds in our ears every morning. A few technical instructions as we get started. Please submit your questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to as many of those as we can during the course of the hour today. Please enter your comments and well wishes for Brad in the chat box, also found down at the bottom of your screen, and it'll be nice to see what you have to say as we chat today.
Be gentle.
Yes, exactly. And finally, we will send out a recording of today's event to all of you. That way you can share this session with those who weren't able to join us this morning or watch it again at your convenience. So welcome to everyone who's with us today. And Brad, congratulations on a long run, not only at King FM, but at several other stations before you arrived here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's been a joy and continues to be a joy.
Yeah.
There's only one thing I will not miss after December 23rd. I'll miss all of you. I'll miss the station. I'll miss all the things we do here. I will not miss getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning.
My gosh.
The only thing I will not miss, and you've done it enough to know what that's like.
Yeah, it takes me a week to recover from that. And during your entire time at King FM, you were the morning person.
I've done the morning show, since November of 1989.
Yeah. I want to know your radio origin story. I mean, how did you end up in this line of work in the first place?
It really came about in rather a remarkable way. I was going to school in Portland studying political science, intending on being a teacher. And I started listening to talk radio when I took my breaks. I'd take a break from the studies, sometimes a long break from the studies, and listen to talk radio. And there was one host in particular who caught my attention. And I used to call his show maybe twice a month, no more than that, and disagree with him about one thing or another, or recommend a book that I'd read or a film I'd seen, something like that. And one day at the end of that call, he said, "Would you mind leaving your name and number with my producer?" And I thought, I'd mentioned a book. I thought he wanted to talk more about the book. But I got a call the next day from the manager of the station.
Wow.
Saying, "We really like your phone calls and we'd like you to audition to be a talk show host." And I said what probably is the stupidest thing one could say in a situation like that. I said, "Well, I've never done it before." But he said something even stupider. He said, "Well, no one's ever done it till the first time." And I said, "Well, I can't argue with that." So that very night, I auditioned for the show and started in radio.
Wow. And this was in Astoria?
This was in Portland.
Oh, in Portland. Okay. Yeah. You grew up in Astoria, though.
Grew up in Astoria, if it can be said I grew up at all, and you can get quite a bit of controversy going about that. But yeah, we traveled around a lot. My dad was military, but Astoria was always the family hometown.
Mm-hmm.
And it's still a place that I love to get to whenever I can.
Yeah. Talk radio. I've done some news and information broadcasting in my time.
Mm-hmm.
And I just can't imagine, being a talk radio host every day, the pressure of coming up with topics, just keeping the conversational balls in the air. What was that like?
There was a time that I loved it. To be honest, what happened was right about the time I switched over to being a classical music morning host, talk radio started changing. And it's become very, very politicized and very angry. And it's not the sort of radio I really want to do anymore. Mm-hmm. But for a while, when I was doing it, it was very news oriented. So we might have someone on who was a newsmaker. We might have the governor on to talk about something, or the mayor. And we did a mix of topics. We'd talk about a movie that was opening, or we'd talk about, sometimes music. In fact, when I was in Portland, I had the conductor of the Oregon Symphony on once a year to preview the coming season. Wow. We do that sort of thing, which I enjoyed, but I don't miss that at all, just because talk radio has changed so much. Coming to King FM was, we're saying classical King, I know it's good, it's still King FM. It was King FM then, was a bit of an experiment because Peter Newman, who many people know Peter and have known him for years, he was the program director who hired me. And we both decided we'd try this for a year. I wasn't sure if I wanted to do it or not, to be totally honest. I loved the music, but I wasn't sure I would adjust to doing the morning show. But after a year, I said, no, I want to stay. And been here all this time.
Yeah. What did Peter hear in you, or what was his instinct to reach out to you to do a classical format?
Well, what happened was I came to Seattle. That time I'd lived here before, but I came to Seattle to work in management for King AM. There was a King AM in those days. It was a news and talk station. And as it turned out, part of my job was to fill in for talk show hosts when they took time off. And so Peter heard me and really enjoyed the sense of humor that he heard on the show. He wanted a classical music show that related to pop culture, that related to what was going on in the world, and that had a real sense of humor to it. So that was his objective. And it was kind of a daring move on his part. I mean, I would have never walked into King FM and asked for a job, even though I love classical music, simply because I figured this is a major market. This is a huge city. They're not going to hire me. I've never done it before. And that story is kind of interesting too, because I basically am at King FM because I went to Peter Newman one day when I was working for the AM and asked if I could get free symphony tickets. I was trying to smoosh my way into free symphony tickets. And Peter said, I didn't know you liked classical music. And I said, I love it. And so he said, would you ever mind filling in for me on King FM, which I did a few times before I was actually hired to do mornings.
Yeah. Well, what was your classical music epiphany? Because you didn't grow up as a musician necessarily.
Not at all. No, not at all. Not at all. I'm still not a musician, except for the fact that I love the music. Actually, and I didn't grow up in a family that was a classical music family. My family was very much into jazz, and I still love jazz to this very day. But what happened was when I was a senior in high school at Astoria High School, the Helsinki Philharmonic came and performed. Wow. There was something around in those days, I'm not sure if they still are, called community concerts, where 5 or 6 small towns would get together and bring a major performer or orchestra on tour around the country. And because Astoria was then the largest collection of Finnish-speaking people outside of Finland in the world, they thought it was appropriate to have the Helsinki Philharmonic come to Astoria. And it just blew me away. I mean, I'd never heard a live classical music concert before in my life. And I can still get tingles in my spine thinking of when they played Finlandia.
Wow.
It was just an amazing experience. And that was right before I was going off to college. And of course, in college, you can always find free concerts because the music department's always staging brown bag concerts or whatever. And then one of my best friends at the time was madly in love with a woman who was a pianist, Roxanne, I remember her name still. And so to impress her and to learn more about classical music, he bought like 100 vinyl albums back in those days. And then they broke up and he gave all the albums to me. So thank you, Roxanne. I managed to get that music, which I listen to all the time. But I should say too, that radio was a very important part of my getting involved with classical music. We talk about that during our fund drives here, and it's so true because it's accessible. I mean, every evening when I'd be doing the dishes, I'd be listening to classical music on the radio. And without that radio, I wouldn't have had that sort of immediate connection to the music and where the performances were going to be and all that sort of thing going on.
Yeah.
This was in Portland, but had I been in Seattle, it would have been King FM I would have been listening to.
Yeah. A number of our participants who are on the Zoom call today, the webinar, whatever we're characterizing this.
Webinar makes it sound like we're really sort of dispensing professorial information here, and I like that.
Oh, are we not?
It's a webinar. Yeah.
Well, one of our viewers wrote in, do you have any musical interests that may surprise King FM listeners? You talked about jazz.
What probably would surprise King FM listeners, it surprises most of my friends that regard it with a certain amount of scorn. I like 80s rock and roll. I like a lot of that music. I mean, I don't own any of it. I don't listen to it at home all the time. But if you're out in the car somewhere driving along, some of that sort of stuff from the 80s plus 90s. I like a lot of the grunge stuff that was popular in the 90s.
Yeah. What about I would think the 70s would be area, not so much, huh?
The 80s and 90s musically were more calling to me.
Yeah. One of the viewers asked, what is your very favorite piece of music? That's always a hard one.
That's a really difficult one to do. I would think to this very day, it probably would be Finlandia because of that first connection. But I will say also, if I'm ever feeling a little down and I want some energy, I always grab the Brandenburg concertos. I love all 6 of those Brandenburg concertos by Bach. But it's impossible it just depends on my mood at the moment.
Yeah.
That's one of the delightful things about working here, of course, is we have all of this music around us all the time. And no matter what my mood is, something that I'm going to play in the morning is going to fit that mood.
Yeah.
And hopefully the mood of people listening out there as well.
You interviewed one time Jerry Seinfeld. That's just one name on a most impressive list of extraordinary characters.
That was during my King AM days, and I was filling in afternoon drive on King AM. I've had like a minute's notice before going on the air because somebody couldn't make it at the very last minute. Jerry Seinfeld, who was in town doing a gig, he actually was a headliner at the Comedy Underground in Pioneer Square. That was before the television show, right before the television show. And so he walked in, and I was so frantic about trying to put a show together at the last minute. I said something to him like, well, you'd better be funny. Because I'd never heard him before. And he was funny. And he was scheduled for 15 minutes and stayed for an hour and a half and talked about being a road comic and this sort of thing. And he said, I don't want to talk about this on the air, but off the air, he said, I've got this pilot out for this new television show. I don't think that it will ever be picked up by the network. I think it's too Jewish and the network will not pick it up.
Wow.
But my agent thinks they will. And of course, he was, I'm sure, happy to be really wrong about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Some of the hardest interviews you've ever done.
The hardest interview I've ever done actually was with a really, really decent man. He was a monk who had been doing work with street people on this overnight kind of shelter. And he won like the award for the most, what's the word I want? Maybe benevolent person in Portland. He won some sort of award for doing all this great work with street people at night. And so I had him on the show, and maybe because he was a monk, I'm not sure what, but he was a man of very, very few words. And I remember saying, so what's it like out there on the street at night? And he said, tough. And I said, can you elaborate? And he said, plenty tough. So I congratulated him, and we moved on pretty quickly from that.
Yeah. One of the things you and I talk about in the studios a lot, we both spent time in cities associated with the American space program.
Yes.
We've bantered about all things astronomical and related to space exploration. How was it? It was Houston. It was your home for a while.
Yeah, in the suburbs of Houston, a place called Katy outside of Houston, and Austin as well for a while. My father did some work in connection with NASA. He wasn't part of NASA, but he did some work in connection with them. And I think probably almost all of us who grew up when we did had a love affair with the space program. It was just so exciting. I remember being out here on the West Coast and getting up at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning to watch those launches from Cape Kennedy back in the day.
Yeah.
So it was, and it's still to this very day, I'm fascinated by all of that. You know, we've been talking off the air about the exploration of Mars and the rovers and the rest of it. It's
thrilling. You mentioned, tell me more about your parents, and I wonder if they were talkers or writers or thinkers or all the things that kind of go into forming a radio career. Or
I think that's true, and I think that was especially something that led me into talk radio all those years ago, because we watched the news together as a family, and then over dinner we talked about the news every day. And if I didn't know what was going on at that day, it was an embarrassing sort of thing. You just didn't want to not know what was happening. So I grew up in a very news-oriented, political, but not in a partisan way, family. Talking about the world, what's happening in the world, what's happening in the country, and that was always true. My parents have both passed on now, but all the time that they were here, that was the discussions that we would always have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There was a very touching phase of your career when your mother got ill, and you actually can you tell me about what you did during that time?
Well, yeah, actually, she got ill, an illness that took her life eventually after about 9 months, but she was in Portland and really couldn't be moved, and so I was doing. This, in fact, ties in with the talk radio thing, because I decided back in 2000 to experiment and see if I wanted to do a little talk radio on the side. And so a station in Portland hired me. I said I could work only weekends, and so that was the way it was. And that station gave me a studio to use so I could do the King FM show from Portland. So for 7 months, we did the King FM show from Portland. No one ever knew. In fact, sponsors, we were commercial then, sponsors didn't know. I mean, there were probably people in management who didn't know. Nobody knew the show was coming from Portland. It was that technically well handled.
That's beautiful.
By a man named David Brown that you probably remember, who was here, and some other people as well.
That's excellent. And again, a number of listeners who sent in notes and questions in advance, and this is from Wilfred Cameron, and he says, when I moved to Seattle in 1990, I knew that the weather here was difficult to predict. I needed someone on the leading edge of climate technology to keep me well informed.
I can see where this is.
That's when I discovered Brad Eaton. Using the latest in bird-based technology, Brad expertly predicted the day's weather based on the number of birds that he counted on the wires outside his studio. Always right on, I think. Been a Brad fan for over 30 years now, and I'm going to miss sharing the morning with him. Thank you so much, Wilfred.
Those birds weren't just on a wire. They were on a Denny's restaurant sign across from the King Broadcast Center over on Dexter. And every morning, I just did it as a lark bird pun there. One morning, I just said, I wonder if the birds gathering on the sign indicate something about the inclement weather coming our way. And Peter Newman suggested, why don't you do it every day? That'd be a fun thing to do. So I did, and it really caught on. One of the Seattle newspapers did a story about it. And one day, my favorite story connection with the birds, what is that, ornithometeorological prognostication, was one time when the people at Denny's put up one of those plastic owls to chase the birds away.
Oh, yeah.
And so I came on the air and bemoaned the dreaded pseudo owl, as I called it. And they had something like 250 phone calls at Denny's saying, get rid of the owl.
That's
so
funny.
They did. And I'm sure they realized that they were getting, free publicity out of this, because we talked about the Denny's sign. And nobody would have suspected, because there was never any payoff or anything. Nobody would have suspected that, because I can tell you if that had been the case, it would have been, the Dahlia Lounge or some other restaurant we would have been counting the birds on.
What kind of media sensation did this cause? Because there were a lot of stories written about it, as I recall.
Yeah, there were a couple of newspaper stories. There was a television story. In fact, the Daily Asturian back in Astoria, they sent someone up to do a story on it. This kind of like this Astoria kid is actually doing this weird thing with the bird in Seattle. Yeah, and when we moved, of course, we moved to Lower Queen Anne, and once we moved over there, we didn't have access to the birds anymore, and nor do we here. But Rich Marriott, which some people may remember from his weather forecasting days at Channel 5 television, he used to always joke with me saying he was fearing being replaced by the birds. Just have a camera out there on the Denny's sign and not him anymore.
Oh, that's so funny. Well, you mentioned the lark pun, and we have a question. What is your secret for being such an undisputed punster champion? And this comes from a colleague of ours, Lisa Bergman.
Hi, Lisa. I don't really know. It's just a natural sort of thing for me. Like the lark comment just leapt into my mind. It flew into my mind.
Yes, of course.
I don't know if there's any sort of special technique. I just have the mind that thinks that way, I guess. Some people like it, some people don't. Everybody groans. But I definitely always enjoy a good pun.
Yeah, absolutely. What are some things, is another question from listeners, that you always like to have with you in the studio?
Ooh, coffee for sure. Definitely coffee. And we have, because obviously we have a lot of brand new and wonderful equipment that we're using here in our new facilities, and we have very strict rules about that. And when we started here, when we moved into the Seattle Opera Center, where we are now, remember the first day that we were here, everybody got a mug with their name on it, and one that seals from the top so they can't spill it in the studio, which is really nice.
Safety first. Yeah.
But when I get here in the morning, and I arrive here about 5 o'clock, about an hour before going on, because the first part of the show, can I confess, is the very first part of the show is pre-recorded. We go live at 6 every morning. And when I get here at 5, the first thing I do is go into the kitchen and make a pot of coffee, because that's the one thing. And of course, notes for the show and all the rest of those things that you'd expect to have.
Yeah. I know for a fact too, there have been squirrels in the studio when you broadcast.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, yes. There was a long running sort of series of jokes having to do with squirrels, because I was married once upon a time, and my ex-wife's nickname was the Squirrel, because she could make, in high school, she was quite fun at parties, I'm sure, all these very, very convincing squirrel sounds. So, so I started, people give me squirrels just because of that. Yeah. And so I started bringing some in. Eventually, though, there was a complaint about them being in the studio. I'm not sure who that came from, and I respect it totally. So they're not in there now, but they are on my desk. Yeah. Well, I have to confess, I think I had something to do with the complaints about the squirrels, because when we closed up my mother's house, she had all these collections of little toy squirrels. So at one point, I added to your squirrel collection. Indeed, and I appreciate on any given morning, there would be 5 or 6 squirrels in the studios at King FM. It would be what is the word? A flock? Yeah. What is the word for a group of squirrels? I'm not sure. We'll have to check. Anyone know? Let us know. But I'm sure it's some sort of FCC violation. Let's talk about that. Yeah. Such a wonderful sense of humor, Brad. And how was it developed? How was it nurtured? I think, very naturally, because I grew up in a home where there was always a lot of jokes. My mother was a punster, was quite a punster, and that's probably the beginning of that. But I mean, if you could I remember one time it was close to Christmas time, and I was probably 12 years old or something like that. And my mother and I started this pun session on trees, having to do with trees. like pining for you and, so forth and so on. And that went on for a couple of days. You wouldn't think there'd be that many tree puns, but there were.
Favorite comedians and humor influences over the years?
Gosh, I love Paula Poundstone, one of my favorite comedians. I love a lot of the local comedians. There's a guy named Brad Upton, who's a local guy. He travels around a lot now, but very, very funny. I used to go to, and that's something I will do, by the way, after retirement, when I have more control over my time, is to go to comedy clubs, because I love to go to comedy clubs and hear comics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're friends of yours. You kind of hang out in the circles of comics.
Yeah, totally, that's totally true.
Yeah,
and I pictured imagining circles of comics. That's true. That's no, it's true.
And that just you got to know these guys after seeing them, or
yeah. Well, started when I came to Seattle, when I was working here back and just started working for King AM and then eventually the FM side. I started going to the Comedy Underground, and one of the comedians there was someone I'd seen in Portland and met when he was performing in Portland. And we became really, really good friends. He's one of my very best friends to this very day. And so I just started going down there on a really regular basis, and they would just let me in. I would reach for my wallet every time when I went down there. And finally, my friend Carl said, Brad, don't do that. I'm not going to charge you. And so I managed to hear a lot of wonderful comedians. And it's astonishing when you think of all the people that have gone on to great comedic fame who went through Seattle and at the Comedy Underground in its day.
Mm-hmm. Names that come to mind.
Jerry Seinfeld, of course, leaps to mind. Paula Poundstone is another one who leaps to mind. Ellen DeGeneres. They all had not their start, but in the early days when they were road comics and still traveling around. Jon Stewart, someone else who'd been there as a road comic long before his political days.
Did you were speaking of hard interviews, I won't mention their names because they're some of my favorite comics, but they came in for either book tours or some sort of promotional tours, and I had wonderful experiences with David Sedaris and Merrill Marco, who used to work on the Letterman show.
Yeah.
But there was a couple of comics that the interviews did not go well. I don't know if
I've had that happen too. And when I was working at this one particular radio station in Portland, we had a regular deal. I did afternoons from noon until 4, and on every Friday at 3:00, the headliner from a comedy club in town would come in and be my guest. And there were times when it was amazing, and a lot of comics make wonderful, wonderful interview guests. But there were those who just, if they're not in their element, I think it's the people. There are at least two basic kinds of comics, in my opinion. There are people that have an act. They actually write their jokes. They have an act. They do the same jokes. So the people that do it well, you'd never know that it was something they wrote 5 months ago, maybe. Yeah. Then there are people like Paula Poundstone who are just really spontaneous. Now, Paula makes a great talk show guest because she just thinks spontaneously. But I think people, they're not in their element. They're not on the stage controlling, what's going on. You're asking them the questions and they feel uncomfortable with it. Mm-hmm. And almost anybody who's uncomfortable does not make a good interview guest, in my experience.
Exactly. Is stand-up something you've ever aspired to or thought about?
I've thought about it, but it just kind of terrifies me. It's funny because I can go on the radio every morning and speak to thousands and thousands of people, as we all do here. And that doesn't make me nervous in the least, but you put me in front of 10 or 15 people in a comedy club and I'll be nervous. We did for a while, Classical King was doing a series of piano concerts from downtown. Remember those piano concerts?
Yeah.
From downtown?
Steinway
Hall. And so Joel Fan, who's one of my favorite pianists and a really nice guy, was in town, and I interviewed him on the stage and introduced him to an audience of maybe, 50 people, something like that. I worried about that for days ahead of time. If I could have gotten out of it that day, I certainly would have. But once I got up there, I was just fine. And Joel was very helpful. But stand-up comedy is a little scary for me.
Yeah. We have more questions, again, from colleagues. This is from Ted Askew, who says, I know that you've traveled all over the world on King FM journeys. Do you have a most memorable King FM travel moment?
Oh, wow. Boy, that's tough because there have been so many amazing ones. I think that the trip, and we did this more than once, that I remember most fondly of all was something we called the Winter Waltz. And it was in December, right between Thanksgiving and Christmas. And we would go to Vienna. And there's no city in the world I've ever seen that decorates quite like Vienna does at Christmas time. It's just beautiful. And then we go to Salzburg, Mozart's hometown, and hang out there for 2 or 3 days, often with snow on the ground. And then we go to Prague for 2 or 3 days and then fly back again. And that was a memorable trip, different every time, but always just being in Europe at that time of the year. I highly recommend if people are planning to visit Europe, don't just go in the summertime. It's really wonderful to go in the winter as well. And especially during that Advent season between Thanksgiving and Christmas, it's a beautiful time to be there.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd say that one. Plus China. We did a China trip.
I always remember you telling me the story of a quartet of Seattle musicians, string quartet playing. Well, you tell them.
Yeah, it was back in the days when Northwest Chamber Orchestra was here, and we had 4 musicians from Northwest Chamber Orchestra go with us on this trip to China. It was a 3-week trip. We traveled all around China, and they performed at the Great Wall of China. There's a guest house at the Great Wall outside of Beijing. And as far as we know, that's the first Western musicians who ever have performed, officially at least, at the Great Wall.
Wow.
They'd never allowed that before. And our guide had an uncle who was, high up in the party or whatever, I don't know. And he was able to arrange this for us. So we were out there.
I always envy you too, talking about being at the St. Thomas Church in Leipzig. That seems...
Yes. Oh, that was another amazing. And that's another amazing trip, was that trip to Germany. We made just a few years ago now. And Leipzig, of course, music center of the world at one time, you could say. Mm-hmm. Certainly music center of Johann Sebastian Bach. And we were in the church hearing the Christmas oratorio that Bach wrote in the very church where he wrote it.
Yeah.
It was just amazing. And Leipzig's a wonderful, wonderful city. I highly recommend Leipzig and Dresden as places to go. We didn't for years and years go there because they were in East Germany, and we didn't go to East Germany. But now we can.
Mm-hmm. You went to, was it Yellowknife? You went, there's the international destinations and these kind of offbeat destinations.
Well, that was just, I think of one friend of mine in particular who mercilessly kids me about it this very day. I went to Yellowknife to look for the Aurora Borealis, and because I'd never been there before. Sometimes I just like to go someplace just because I'd never been there before. So it was just me. And Yellowknife is a long ways north. It's 900 miles north of Edmonton, which is a long ways north of here. Did not see the Aurora Borealis, but had a great time. I just kind of wandered around. It's a very interesting little city. And that was my Yellowknife experience. Yeah. Found out the people that live there call it the knife. Yeah.
Do you, what's on your bucket list for travel? Where would you still like to go?
Oh, gosh, back to a lot of places, but I'd like to go to Thailand. I've never been there. I'd like to go to Australia. I've never been there. New Zealand, likewise, I've never been there. And although it may sound kind of strange, Antarctica, I'd like to do one of those Antarctic trips one of these days while it's still there before it all melts away. Yeah,
exactly. Tell me how it was that you happened to go and study in Finland.
Oh, well, it was just it was a summer sort of thing, just a chance to learn the Finnish language, a little bit of the Finnish language. They have an intensive course at the University of Helsinki, the Yliopisto Helsingin, as they would say. And so it was purely to experience the country and to hear some of the language and learn some of the language. Mm-hmm. I'd love to go and I'd like to go to Finland in the winter. I'd love to go and spend some additional time there.
Yeah. With such a big Finnish representation in Astoria, were you immersed in the culture in some ways? Or?
No, we were. In fact, it's kind of funny. I chuckle when I think of going to high school in Astoria because some of the history classes, like I think of one older Finnish woman who was a wonderful teacher, but the way she taught European history, it was all about this amazing country called Finland and a few other places, like England and France and places that didn't matter all that much because most of our learning was focused on Finnish history, which is quite interesting, actually. Mm-hmm. And you had to, when I was growing up there, you had to speak Finnish to work in a lot of the retail stores because a lot of the women in particular had not gone out to work in the community and did not speak English. They just spoke Finnish. And Finnish is a very different language from English, a very difficult language to learn.
Yeah. We have plenty of time for your questions. If you'd like to submit them in the chat box. As we continue with Brad Eaton, we're celebrating his 33 years in radio. I wanted to, you mentioned studying in Portland, but UCLA was your.
Oh, Portland.
Oh, okay.
It's in Portland.
Yeah. But did you attend UCLA?
No.
Oh, okay.
No. Hung out there a lot.
Oh,
at one time.
Yeah.
And someone very close to me went to UCLA, so
okay.
I talked about it.
All right, very good. I'm just conflating them. But Los Angeles though is
I've spent some time there, yeah. And in fact, I plan on spending more time there. That's one of the things I'm going to do after I retire.
Mm-hmm.
So, I want to write a book, and more about that much later when the book is underway. Yeah. But I kind of want to do that in the sunshine of Southern California. So,
mm-hmm. Have you written before?
No,
No.
nothing other than just like writing for the high school newspaper, that sort of thing.
Yeah. We're talking about Finland and your time there, and I need to thank you for teaching me to swear in Finnish.
Yes. We won't do it here.
We're not going to know, with all due respect to our Finnish speaking friends, but you've taught me essentially a word that translates roughly balderdash.
Yeah, balderdash. Yeah,
it comes in handy every
putting
once
it.
in a
One
while.
of those B words. Yes, it does. Yes, yeah.
Very good. What is a funny behind the scenes story or incident that we as listeners may never have known, since radio is something we listen to versus watching?
Well, that's a good question, actually. A funny incident. It's hard to come up with a funny incident off the top of my head. I suppose one of the things that people might be surprised by is that sometimes you'll see people that have a very distinguished cultured approach on the air, in the summertime, dressing very casually, not the way you'd expect to see people come into a radio station, but it's radio, so it doesn't really matter. But offhand, I can't think of anything that happened behind the scenes, at least that I could talk about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Getting locked out of the station with the record playing, or any like technical moments like that.
We did have at one point in the studios over on Harrison Street, we had this failure in the system, the power system that powered the essential services at the station. Somehow it was wired backwards. So when the power failed, the essential systems went down and the non-essential systems stayed up. Like we had the coffee maker, but not the transmitter. We were off the air for a number of hours and locked out. We couldn't get into the building because the security system locked us out. So we had to literally wait until someone who owned the building came down and brought a key to get in. And it was several hours. And this was right after 9/11. And there were a lot of people who thought maybe there was something of a terrorist nature that had happened in Seattle, happened to the radio station. But it was just a fluctuation in the power that apparently knocked our system off the air.
We have other listener questions. What is the first thing you will do as a retiree?
Sleep in.
Yeah.
Sleep in. Well, I tend to kind of take it easy, sleep in, do a little bit of traveling, get ready for the move to California, which I plan to do probably, 2 or 3 months into the new year. I'll always, by the way, not that anyone's wondering about this, but I will always be a part of Seattle, and Seattle will always be a part of me. I'll always be visiting here a lot. Seattle is really home. I've lived here longer than any place else ever in my life, and it's always going to be home, even if I'm in LA soaking up the sunshine and writing my book. Yeah, very good. One of our viewers says, how did you manage to get up at 4 a.m. after going to comedy clubs, which go notoriously late? I've got to say, people often will talk about getting older and what they do and don't notice about getting older. And I have to say, I don't really notice a lot of anything about getting older, except I really need more sleep now than I did when I was like 30. And back when I was starting out at King FM doing the morning show, I would go maybe a night a week to a comedy club and a night a week to a jazz club. Wow. And I'd get maybe 4 hours sleep if I was really, really lucky. And I could come in the next morning and no one would ever know. I'm not saying I couldn't do that now, but I couldn't do it very many nights in a row. Yeah. What do you think you'll miss most about being on the air? Oh, gosh. I think it's the sharing of the music with people, because the music is always something I will have with me. I'll always enjoy the music, and I'll enjoy listening to people play the music on the air here after I'm gone. But there's something about sharing the music with people that's a very special kind of thing, being able to kind of share some insight into the music, which is something we're doing more here now these days than we used to, sharing stories and insight into the music. I will miss that. Yeah. And you might find me at home, kind of playing radio and doing my show. Don't tell anyone I said that. New interests that you want to devote time to in your retirement? Ooh, that's a good question. Well, of course, travel is not a new interest. I would have to say maybe photography. I find photography really interesting, and I've done just a little bit of it. I took a photography class way back in high school days. I wouldn't mind doing something like that because, now we all carry around really high quality cameras, just on our phones. Right there, yep. And occasionally, I'm not skilled at all as a photographer, but occasionally I'll take a photo and I'll think, wow, that's really cool. I really like that. I'd like to do more of that. Very good. This is a former colleague of many of us at Classical King and a good friend of Brad's,
I'll just read this and then tell you who it's from. Most associate Brad with morning coffee, Mozart at 8, and manic commutes made more soothing. Precious few of us know that in addition to a stellar radio announcer, he's also an architecture aficionado, sun worshiper, passionate world traveler, history nerd, Los Angeles history nerd, Trekkie, and so many more wacky and wonderful things. I feel privileged to have known, worked, and gabbed with Brad for 11 years and counting, and I wish him all the best as he embarks on this new life chapter. Do you know who that's from?
Very nice. I have no idea at all.
That's from your friend Jill Kimball.
Oh, it is.
Yeah,
right. Well,
yeah.
Hi to Jill.
Yeah, so Jill brings up a couple things. Architecture aficionado.
I love architecture.
Yeah.
I love architecture. Indeed, everything to do with architecture is of great fascination to me.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, Jill is a friend of mine who also loves architecture. And so what I do kind of in my circle of friends is if I come across an article or whatever that I think is going to interest someone, I'll send it to them. And Jill probably has her inbox jammed more than she'd like with architectural articles and this sort of thing, because when I see that sort of thing, I think of her. I am taking during the weekend, Thanksgiving weekend, I'll be in Los Angeles, and I'm going to take an architectural tour of Hollywood.
Oh, fantastic.
Frank Lloyd Wright homes and other homes in Hollywood on the day after Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
And I love doing that sort of thing. The last time I was in LA for Thanksgiving, we took a trip out to Palm Springs and an architectural tour of Palm Springs, which is also fascinating.
Mm-hmm. And Jill mentions interest in Los Angeles history in general. What is? Tell me more about that, and what is it about that place that really intrigues you?
Well, I think LA is one of those places that kind of everybody knows. It's been a part of people's lives because of the entertainment industry, I think, because it's been such a pace-setting city in so many ways. And I have a really good friend named Paula, who might even be watching, I don't know, in LA, who loves LA history and has a whole bunch of books on LA history. And so from a fairly early point on, because I've known her since high school, I started getting interested in Los Angeles history and have taken a number of historical tours in addition to the architectural tours, which are really interesting to do.
Yeah. I'm always so fascinated by a place like the Hollywood Bowl.
Yes.
Down there.
Yes,
and
yes.
I know you've seen a lot of great content. Maybe you can just talk about that a little bit, because you've come back from trips down there, and we talk about these extraordinary concerts.
I think maybe as a cellist, you might appreciate that one of the really superb experiences that I had the privilege of having at the Hollywood Bowl was to hear Yo-Yo Ma play all 6 unaccompanied Bach cello sonatas.
Yeah.
All 6 of them together. And then at the end of that time, he still managed to do an encore presentation of a couple of other pieces of music, but all 6 right in a row, just bam, 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 bam. It's just amazing. And the Hollywood Bowl, which can be a noisy place because you got a lot of people outside, you could have heard a pin drop, as I say, when people were listening to Yo-Yo Ma perform.
Yeah.
So that was just amazing.
Maybe I've only been there. I've been there very few times, but the first time I was there in the early 80s, and I think Zubin Mehta was the music director.
Yes.
And we went to a performance of the Mahler Third Symphony.
Mm-hmm.
And the first thing I remember is my father and I were going to the Hollywood. We ran into Rob Reiner, like we literally bumped into him, and I said, "Dad, that's Rob Reiner." Right? So just what an LA thing, just seeing celebrities. But then there's an offstage trumpet solo in one of the movements of this big Mahler Third Symphony.
Mm-hmm.
And we're sitting there listening, watching the stage, and all of a sudden the trumpet comes from out in the woods. It was one of the most stunning effects I've ever heard.
That sounds wonderful. I can imagine. I've not heard that, but I can imagine that. So the Hollywood Bowl is a very special place, and to be there at sunset is especially interesting because the sun goes down and you see the lights of the city kind of coming on around you.
Yeah.
Wonderful. It's an amazing spot.
Yeah. And following up on the architecture piece, are there buildings around here that especially intrigue you, or have you dove into Seattle architecture so
much? Not as much as I'd like to be honest, but there are some great buildings around here, new and older buildings. The Smith Tower is an amazing building. I love that one. That for how many years was the tallest building west of the Mississippi River? Right, exactly. And trying to think of what else. I like the building, 2 Union Square building is what I like. And there's another one where I'm trying to think of what it's called, the City Center building, which is fairly new, maybe 10 or 15 years old downtown, that I really like a lot.
Yeah.
And of course, the Pike Place Market. I love the market.
Mm-hmm. That is your home, if I can say.
Yes, that's true. That's my home.
Okay, very good. Another letter here from viewer. Dear Brad, yours was the voice that I awakened to each morning, gentle and comforting to start my day. Many times I would just lay in bed reveling in the music, even though it meant I had to scramble to make it to work on time. Thank you for all the beautiful music, the cherished favorites, and the introduction to unfamiliar works and artists. Enjoy your well-deserved retirement. May you enjoy the morning shot of musical espresso as you languish in bed. So
all right. I love that. I love that.
From Lisa Tobin. When Brad moves to LA, asks one of our viewers today, will he be giving any lectures to classical music or opera audiences before the performances?
Not that I know of. I wouldn't close the door on that, but I have no specific plan to do something like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's not impossible. It's not even impossible. I'll do a little bit of radio from time to time. I don't know, but it's not impossible. I would not say never.
Exactly. Have you played, I think I know the answer to this, but have you played any instruments in your early years that may have influenced you to take this particular job at Classical King?
No.
Yeah.
I don't play any musical instruments at all. It's just a love of the music that brought me here and has kept me here all these years.
Yeah. Which may be the second part. Otherwise, how and why did you commit to so many years? Love of music being one answer.
Yeah, I do love it. I love this is a great place to work, as I don't need to tell you. And in the radio business in particular, it's very, very unusual for people to work more than 2 or 3 years at a station. People move around a lot in the radio world. And King FM is really unusual in that we have a lot of people who've been here for a long time. It's a great place to work.
Yeah.
And I found, although in recent years, the getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning thing has been a little bit annoying at times. I love doing the show. And so I didn't see any reason to move on to anywhere else. I just really enjoyed it.
How many different formats did you do? Was it primarily talk radio?
Primarily, I worked on the coast in Astoria for a while, and I was the news person at a station there. But being a small station, I did a rock show on the air and all sorts of different things. But primarily, it's been news and talk, and then, of course, classical music here. My first classical music I ever played on the air wasn't really here. It was at a little community station in Portland called KBOO. Mm-hmm. And it was a wonderful station, a wonderful place to be. And that kind of gave me my first taste of playing classical music on the air.
Yeah. I think musical likes, we've covered that. Francis Walton, great cellist and conductor and King FM supporter, wants to pick your brain about languages. We may have to punt this one to linguists, but I heard that there's a connection between Finnish language and Hungarian. Can you clarify or speak to
that's
that?
a subject of a lot of dispute, actually. Probably not. The Finnish language is part of a linguistic group called the Finno-Ugric linguistic group. And Hungarian is not a part of that. But the reason that people have thought that is that there are some structural similarities and some similarities in vocabulary between Hungarian and Finnish, but it's still up for grabs in the academic world. Mm-hmm. There's also an interesting kind of correlation between some Finnish language structure and Korean, from way on the other side of the world practically. Mm-hmm. But Finnish is a very, very unusual language. I mean, for example, in Finnish, if you say you're going to a place or coming from a place, you actually change the way you say the name of the place to indicate your relationship to it. Like, if you're going to Helsinki, you would say you're going Helsingista. If you're leaving it, you'd say you're going Helsingiin. So you actually indicate your movement, your direction in connection with a place by changing the name of the place itself and the way it's pronounced.
Yeah. Are you able to speak it? Do you have friends that you can go and hang out with and speak the language?
I don't use it often enough to be anywhere near fluent in it. It's a difficult language, but at one point I can still, as you know, come up with a few phrases.
Yes.
A few well-chosen phrases. But one thing about Finnish that kind of confuses a lot of people is that there aren't a lot of cognates. There aren't a lot of words that are similar, like in a lot of Latin languages, certain words, telephone, telefono, telephone. In Finnish, it's puhelin, which means that which is spoken into. Yeah. So it's just a very, very different sort of language. There are 16 cases in the Finnish language. On the other hand, there are no silent letters, and so no, and very few rules, very few grammatical rules.
Did you delve into other languages, or was
I took French in high school. I took 4 years of French in high school, and had a really good teacher who was very strict, very old world. She'd gone to school in Europe. In fact, she wanted the class to stand up when she came in the room. And I'll tell you, when you were studying with her, and she would say, you know, after we had our introductory chat, she'd say, "Et maintenant, you know, fermez votre livre, you know, close your books, and I'm going to ask questions of you." And you would skip class before you disappoint Madame Gross, and not be there with the proper French. So I find now, if I'm in France, a lot of that comes back to me, and I often say, merci, Madame Gross, wherever you are.
That's great.
So I did study French for that time, and Spanish I picked up. I spent some time in Mexico and some time in Nicaragua, and picked up Spanish there. And of course, Spanish, a very good language to know in Seattle these days, for that matter, and of course in Southern California.
Yeah. Well, it's we identify the people in the shop here at Classical King that can speak whichever languages. You know, you go to Lisa for Hungarian and Swedish and Scandinavian, and Brad
we need
Finnish.
We need to do that because we need to pronounce so many different languages, and nobody knows them all.
Yeah. What are your tips? I mean, I get asked this all the time. How do you pronounce all those languages? How do you answer that question?
I think I won't speak her name, but there was a woman who used to work here who used to always joke around saying, if you don't know how to pronounce it, just give it a vaguely European spin and mumble it a little bit. It's largely just through asking other people, and sometimes it's guessing. And also we also get some good responses from people in the audience who will simply say, you know, I don't mean to correct you, but I am going to, and this is, and we like that, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I like to be corrected. If someone knows, I like to know what they know.
It's an ongoing challenge. Where did you get the idea to do movie cuts like "Wait, I was going to make espresso"?
That was Peter Newman and a friend of ours who used to work for King FM a long time ago that still works with us in special broadcast, named Bill Levy.
Oh, yeah.
Peter and Bill came up with this. And what we had, people that have been listening a long time may remember this. We had a whole bunch of little liners, as they're called in radio, where you would play one of these liners depending on what was happening in the world around you. Like I remember when Ross Perot was running for the presidency, one of the things he used to say, joking about his own ears, was, "I'm all ears." And so we had one that went, "This is Classical King, I'm all ears." And another one that had Spiro T. Agnew saying something like how does that go? A self-centered group of people who can't consider themselves to be intellectuals, something like that. And so we'd have this as Classical King in Seattle, and then we'd have Spiro say, a bunch of impotent intellectual people who imagine themselves as intellectuals.
Yeah,
I don't remember the quote, but it was something like that.
Yeah, they were so great. It was Cary Grant talking about Mozart, or Tom Hulce's laugh from Amadeus, and they were brilliant little liners that were.
In fact, we won a Soundy, which is sort of in the radio world around Seattle, kind of like an Oscar, you know, I mean, on a much smaller scale, for one of those that we produced that used Tony Soprano.
Here's another lovely comment. Once I was driving to work and Brad said, "Here's something you don't get to say every day. Breaking news from the Iditarod." I laughed so hard that I never heard what the breaking news actually was. We'll miss you, Brad, from Marin. Do you recall what the breaking news from the Iditarod?
I think it was that a dog had won.
Oh, okay.
Or a dog team had won.
Yeah, that seems to make sense.
And she's quite right. You don't, and I was quite right at the time. You don't get to say that very often, at least not, and have it be accurate.
Here's another one that speaks to the longevity of Brad here at Classical King FM. I've been waking up to Brad's morning show since I was 3 years old. I'm 29 now, and he's felt like a longtime friend I've started the day with for most of my life. Enjoy your retirement, Brad. You've earned it. From Brittany Eddie Bolster.
Oh, well, thank you, Brittany.
Yeah,
it's very nice.
Do you have listeners over the years that I have some regulars that I correspond with and talk with, and any snapshots of those folks for you?
Yeah, is definitely the case. A lot of the people that I've communicated with over the years are people that have gone on the various trips that I've hosted. You probably had this happen. In fact, I know you have with some of the trips that you've hosted. Those trips are kind of bonding experiences, really, and you really get to know people in those situations.
Absolutely.
To a great degree. I've long since forgotten some of these things, like the Iditarod joke. I remember it now, and it's really wonderful to hear from people things that they remember, because I'm like that. I think of things that I hear on the air, and I'll remember them 15 years in the future because it really made an impression on me. I remember there was a guy who used to do traffic in LA named Bill Keene, and he used to come up with all sorts of puns. And I remember he said that it was a truckload of fish spilled on the Hollywood freeway, and he expected the CHIPS, which is the California Highway Patrol, would be there soon. And to this very day, I remember Bill Keene's fish and chips joke.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I, as I say, I admire your humor, Brad, and your kindness, the way that you engage with the world, you know, with current affairs and the political conversations we've had. You keep company with people with very different viewpoints and worldviews, and I appreciate that.
I like that.
Yeah,
part of what makes life interesting.
I wonder, as you think about people or mentors or institutions that have had a big impact on you and how you show up. Sort of a big, broad question here, but other big influences that we may not have talked about here today that you might want to single out.
You mean people, specific people?
Yeah, or
well, I will say that National Public Radio, as it used to be called, NPR, has been a big influence in my life. The Morning Edition, All Things Considered, those shows, and the various people. And what people are saying about me, which I very much appreciate and I'm humbled by, is how I feel about a lot of the people there. I feel like they're friends, even though I've never met them, because I've listened to them for this amount of time. I like the Christian Science Monitor newspaper, which I think is one of the greatest newspapers in the world. A lot of people think it's a religious paper and they stay away from it, but it's really not at all. Great newspaper. The New York Times, the same way. A wonderful newspaper. So I would say that newspapers and radio have been really important influences in my life.
What kind of space will music have in your life as you take this new path?
Oh, an important space. I mean, as it does now, I will wake up to classical music, I'm sure, and listen to it. I'll probably go to, well, not probably, I will definitely go to more concerts because I'll be able to. It's kind of hard getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning to go to a lot of concerts and stay out very late in the evening, but I'll be able to do more of that in the future.
Another well wish here. Congratulations, Brad. I have been educated, entertained, enthralled, and enlightened by your presence at Classical King FM for your entire tenure as host of the morning show. You are loved and appreciated, and we, your fans, are thrilled to be able to send you off into your next phase of life. May it be filled with adventure, travel, and of course, classical music and other genres that fascinate and fulfill you. That is from Flavia.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
What are you most proud of when you think back of all your years in broadcasting? How do you sum up the legacy, the impact that you've had?
I think I'm proud of being a part of this radio station and proud of being a part of sharing great music with people. You know, one of the things about being in talk radio, which I used to be, is that if I was at a party or somewhere, I just didn't really want people to know that I was a talk show host because it was always so controversial. And, you know, you get some people who'd be upset with you, some people who weren't. Like, I would never go on a cruise or a trip to Europe with talk radio listeners, for example. But we've got such great listeners here, and it's just wonderful to be able to share the music with them, to be able to be a part of this music, which I had nothing to do with composing. It's just here, and I'm able to share it with people. That's a very, that's something in which I take pride.
Yeah. Anything, well, one other thing that I wanted to touch on was I've been privileged to work alongside folks that I very much looked up to, heroes in broadcasting. Did you work with colleagues that really meant a lot, you know, to be in their presence, that maybe kind of blazed the trail for you in any sense?
I still do in some ways. I feel that way about Peter Newman. I've known him and worked with him for such a long time. I loved working with George Shangro, who sadly has passed on, who was a very important part of the station for a long, long time. And pretty much the entire group of people that I work with are inspiring to me.
Yeah. Well, likewise. So,
wow. Okay.
Well, Brad, I want to thank you. Is there anything that I haven't asked you today, or you have so many stories and you're such a font of wisdom and entertainment. What have we not covered here today that you'd like to leave us with?
I would just like to leave everyone with a great deal of appreciation for listening and for communicating today. This has been very, very touching, very moving. And thank you all. And I'm not going away. I mean, going away from doing the morning show, but I'll be around. You'll probably hear me or see me from place to place, maybe on an architectural tour or on the air somewhere even, who knows. But thanks to everyone for making this all possible.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much to everyone who joined in today. As we say, thank you and farewell to Brad Eaton on the occasion of his retirement. 33 years at Classical King, and Brad, as everybody has expressed, you will be much missed. Thank you for the companionship, the good humor, the wonderful music. I've enjoyed the friendship we've developed over the years.
It will go on.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And I will miss checking in with you every morning. So we wish you a happy and fulfillment retirement and lots of blissful sleep that you talked about.
Thank you very much.
And my thanks
Take care, everyone.
My thanks to all who had a hand in planning and producing the event. Brenda Barnes, our CEO, Barbara Dolby and her excellent development staff, Amaya Fox and Tara Taylor, helping out, of course, technical assistance from David Wall there and Terrell McKinney. Thanks to you members of Classical King. And one of the things that has happened over the last few weeks is a number of gifts have been made in honor of Brad, his career and his retirement. And
that's very nice.
Isn't that lovely? So thank you for that. And thank you for taking the time today. I'm Dave Beck, and on behalf of all of us at Classical King, happy trails, Brad. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.